Welcome to the Indie 500 podcast, where normally we talk about a randomly selected album from NME magazine's top 500 albums of all time list. But every now and then we like to take the wheel away from the random album selector and talk about it on a artist or genre of our own choosing. So if you've been keeping up with the show, you may have noticed a running plot line where co-host Helio has begun a bit of a dive into a genre that's always been near and dear to me, which is electronic music. And specifically, one of my favorite corners of electronic music, something called French touch, a genre of house music that had kind of an iron grip on the scene in the 90s. So we wanted to take a pit stop episode to talk about this music and also have on a guest to tell us what's what. And that guest today is journalist and author Martin James. Martin is a professor of creative and cultural industries at Solent University in Southampton. He is the author of 2022's French Connections, From Discotheque to Daft Punk, The Birth of French Touch, as well as the definitive book on the prodigy called We Eat Rhythm. And if he doesn't mind, I wanted to read some of my favorite highlights from the About the Author feature that I believe came from French Connections. And keeping in mind that this is a truncated list where everything else on it is just as great, but it listed he's been pissed on by Iggy Pop, got stoned with Cypress Hill, got drunk with Dave Grohl, and played Resident Evil with Ice-T. He's contributed writing to The Guardian, Melody Maker, and Vox. And he ran away from home at an early age to follow The Clash and Susie and the Banshees. So Martin was there right from the start, documenting the scene from its inspirations to its earliest moments and onto its global breakthrough. And in the process, he inadvertently provided the actual moniker of French touch that became adopted throughout the world. So thanks for joining us, Martin.
Well, thanks for having me. And I feel like I've got old bones now.
So should we call you Professor James, Martin?
Well, I'm actually emeritus professor from Solent University, so formerly professor there, but I'm not at that university anymore. And I'm at Coventry University now. Coventry, famous for the specials and the two-tone scene. So it's a good music city to be in.
Yeah, see, we were steered towards you by asking specifically about, French touch and French house music, but as we became acquainted with your background, I think it definitely applies to more than just that. But we'll see where we go. Could you introduce yourself just a little bit too, if there was anything I missed in there?
Oh God, well, I've been involved in music since I was tiny. I was 14 when I ran away from home to follow The Clash. That's the important thing there. It was barely 1976. So I saw the Sex Pistols in one of their very early gigs in High Wycombe, near where I grew up. The first band I saw was the Pink Floyd, and I was quite bored because it's full of old people who were about 18, 19. And I was like 14, 15. And then I saw the Sex Pistols not long after, and that was it. That was my music. And I think I've stuck with what I kind of vaguely call underground oppositional music ever since. I've always been excited by oppositional music forms, and I find a lot of that in electronic music, which I was drawn to quite quickly, because soon after the punk thing got over the hump of punk, it was amazing in its early days, but it got quite dull, believe it or not, quite quickly. And then I went to the Blitz Club, or Billy's first in Blitz, and it was the David Bowie club run by Steve Strange and Rusty Egan. And that was kind of like this brand new world. And it was all about discovering electronic music and the sort of German niche music scene as well. So, and since then I've just been immersed in clubland, immersed in live music, but in all the oppositional stuff, the stuff that's kind of makes you think harder. I'm not much with mainstream music. I'm not very good with mainstream. I'm terrible in a music quiz because I don't recognize any opening. They could play me a Beatles track and I wouldn't recognize it. but then an obscure, you know, Belgian heartbeat track. I go, oh yeah, yeah, that's such and such. So I'm useless
That's why
in
you're
a
on the
music
trivia
quiz.
team, though. You get the $1,000 question on trivia, though, right? Because nobody will have the obscure answer. You'll have that. So we're still bringing you along.
Yeah, we had one recently. Actually, it was a question about who sang on who's sung lyrics on every Prodigy album. Who sung? I said, well, nobody. And the quizmaster was, well, yes, Maxim has, and Keith Flint, blah blah blah. And I go, no, nobody but Liam Howlett was on one of the albums. Always outnumbered, never outgunned. It was just him, and Maxim wasn't even on the first album. So what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So if you're a quizmaster, don't ask a journalist to be in the room.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Especially
make
not
you
the
look stupid.
expert, yeah. Well, see, you've already mentioned a couple of crossovers with episodes that we've done. So you mentioned David Bowie, and I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 episodes ago, but the album that got served up to us was Let's Dance. And oh geez, there was another one too, and I just forgot because I was so engrossed in the story.
That's all right. It's an interesting album.
Yeah, so I guess coming off of that, like in our David Bowie album, we actually talked a lot about Nile Rodgers and Chic. And one name that I saw that came up kind of in the progenitors of French House and French Touch is a band called Sheila and B Devotion, which he produced for. So I guess I was going to ask, what is kind of the foundation or the kind of historical forerunners for French Touch and French House?
There's a lot of historical forerunners, and one of the reasons I wrote the book French Connections was when Daft Punk came along, a lot of people were saying, well, France, how can France create great dance music, create electronic music? They've never done any great music, you know. You go, well, actually they have. They've got a long tradition, and actually a very long tradition in electronic music. So when you think about musique concrète and that whole form of kind of classical music, really, but it was a form of music that predated the sampler. It was about sampling sounds, recording sounds on tape, and cutting and splicing tape to create echo effects, to create reverb effects, and so on. And so they very much invented in Paris that a lot of the techniques that then became baseline to electronic music anyway. So, but in terms of what we came to know as French Touch, the disco scene was really important, and disco was massive in Paris. Some very important key disco producers and songwriters who went on to dominate the disco scene. But for me, and this kind of ties this back to punk, one of the things that appealed to me is and I do like disco, but when I was a young punk, the tracks that were guaranteed to get the punks, and I used to go to a lot of the London clubs when I was still only 14, 15, and it was the tracks that get people up dancing weren't Iggy and the Stooges and Velvet Underground, all the bands you imagine all the punks to be into. We were, but it was as soon as I Feel Love came on, was that hypnotic
Giorgio Moroder produced.
Giorgio Moroder, yeah, and Donna Summer, and then there were certain touchstones that were disco touchstones that were really important to the punk scene. And a lot of people forget that the punk scene, a lot of the early punks were from the disco scene. You know, we brought the clothes. I brought the clothes from disco into punk, and it was all about the clothes, punk. You know, so when we get to Paris many years later, when I first heard the first tracks I heard that made me jump onto a plane and get over to Paris, it reminded me of that same energy of those early electronic disco tracks, the accidental electronic disco songs. Also reminded me of that the Kraftwerk thing and so on. So it was just a lot of things tied up.
Yeah.
So
and that was the second, the Kraftwerk and the krautrock. We did also do one of the albums we had come up randomly was Noi 75, And
Oh,
then my co-host
brilliant.
Helio actually talked to three different kind of experts of the scene, because that was the last thing that we kind of wanted to have more info and more context on. But yeah, I
Sure.
can definitely see where, there's a straight line from that to the start of, real, like the kind of dance music we're talking about.
I mean, I've got to kind of slightly rewind on this though, because
Yeah.
what happened with French touch became a byword for filtered disco.
Mm.
But in the emergent period, it was a lot of kind of trip hoppy sort of sounds. There was those kind of psychedelic, progressive electronic music like early Air, a band called Mellow. All the stuff that was coming out of there was also drum and bassy type stuff. There's a whole range of stuff. There's a really massive techno scene, incredible free party environment as well. And so that all went into it. It wasn't just this preconceived idea of here's a disco-y sort of vibe with a filtered house track. It started off with a very, very broad sound base, and it became narrower and narrower to the point that everybody was saying, we're not French touch, because it became so narrow. But you can't exclude Air from the story. You can't exclude Etienne de Crécy and Cassius from the story, and Motorbass. Motorbass, I think, were the most important act of all the French touch era. They've lots of different sounds, but also the stuff that Laurent Garnier was really opened a lot of doors for people as well. He's not French touch, but he can't be excluded from the story.
Yeah, I've always had, coming from it mostly from albums and being so removed. We're over in the Pacific Northwest of America. I would just have it with CDs, but Air's Moon Safari was always right next to my Daft Punk CDs, and it's,
Quite right.
yeah, like, yeah, I could see I could see the connections, and I know, and they're both from France, but yeah, there's always been a little bit of, there's always, even as time went on, and you get to that narrow spot, like there's always a little twist, there's always something a little different that's allowed. At least it sounds that way to me.
Well, the thing about Daft Punk were for a very, very different school, if you like. They were from a different part of Paris, but the rest of the scene were from Versailles. So Air came from Versailles. They emerged originally. Nicolas was in a band called Mellow. They were a psychedelic rock the band, sort of prog rock type band, but using electronics. And he started working with members of Funkadelic. So the early Air demos, not the demos of the Moon Safari that have just emerged recently, but the early Air demos, they were members of Funkadelic. It was a very different band. There was a guy called Etienne de Crécy, who was a producer with Philippe Starr, who produced a lot of the French hip hop stuff like MC Solar. He reworked one of the Air tracks, he remixed it and turned it into the Air sound that we now know and love. And then JB joined the band, joined Air, and brought in his classical sort of style as well. So, but the connection there is Etienne de Crécy is a house DJ, as known as a house DJ, but also with Philippe Starr, he set up Motorbass. Motorbass, I said it already, so they are the most important act. They're the act that Daft Punk looked up to. They were the people that everybody looked up to as being, they were doing something new and vital and fresh, and that wasn't just a rehash of the American techno sound or the British techno sound.
Yeah, that'll be one for us to bookmark and dive into. And that's another
It's
like
so it's not in the NME top 500, and I'm not surprised, but it should be number one, to be honest.
Okay. Nice. Yeah. It's not that sometimes we want to do these side episodes when something is, underrepresented or not represented on the list. And I would say this kind of music is close to underrepresented on the list. I meant to
Yeah.
scroll through it before we would
So
again, but I ran out of time.
no worries.
But
Martin, I'm
I was gonna
curious
go.
on those demos you had mentioned of Air with the Funkadelic members. Is that something that's readily available to listen to somewhere?
No. I was lucky to. So I met a guy called Chris Lefriel, who became better known as Bob Sinclair. He had a label called Yellow Productions, and he was in this acid jazz type band at the time. And I met him and went to a cafe near Versailles, and he introduced me to Nicolas, and Nicolas played me some music then. And I'm like, wow. I mean, the irony is he was working with the guy, the bassist he was working with had been lined up to produce my band 10 years earlier.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, and I'm going, how can you afford him? I'm thinking to myself, how can you afford him? And then I realized, yeah, you're all from Versailles. You're a very wealthy group of people.
So that's a kind of a spooky connection, because one of the other albums that we were served up randomly was Funkadelic's One Nation Under a Groove.
What an album that is.
Yeah,
What an album.
that was not a difficult episode to get through.
No, I'll bet.
Yeah, it's always some of them, sometimes when something's unknown or it's not your thing, like, we did that on purpose, so we would be forced to kind of branch out. But sometimes you get a Funkadelic, sometimes you get a David Bowie, and you're like, oh, that's gonna be an easier week on me.
Well, George Clinton
with our eyes closed last week. Yeah.
All right. I think George Clinton of Funkadelic fame is one of the most incredible interviewees I've ever had. I can't give good stories about the interview. He was so much fun to interview because he has his own language. He just talks in his own way, and it's like, well, okay, I'm just going to set the player up and just going to record you talking now.
Yeah,
I'll say in case you said a couple of things, and you can just jump. You just keep on talking. And he was on another planet. It was amazing. The other person I've interviewed like that was Africa Bambaataa, who was just, what are we talking about now? Bam, you're off on another planet. He was there because I got him and Gary Newman together in the same room, because Gary Newman's his hero, and says that Gary Newman is the biggest influence and inspiration on electro. Now, if that's the case, that completely throws a lot of our ideas about electro on their head. Anyway, that's another story for another time, perhaps. It's all important to add it to French touch, because all these sounds and styles were what went into French touch, and also say it links to David Bowie, because they were all massive David Bowie fans. All of those are French touch artists.
Yeah. So, what's the kind of normal path of ascension for an artist in the scene back then? Like, were they playing house parties and moving up to clubs, or were they having to send tapes to labels and getting gigs that way?
Okay, so if we're going to talk specifically about Daft Punk, what they did was they recorded their first 4 tracks, which became the first EP on Soma, the Glaswegian label, and there were DJs from the Soma label who were coming over to Paris regularly, and the guys, the boys from Daft Punk passed their tape over, their cassette tape over, but unbeknownst to them, and they'd shared out quite a few tapes to people, and other people, me included, had passed the tape on to Soma, saying, "You've got to listen to this. You're gonna," and so a lot of people claimed to have been the people that got them signed to Soma. Yeah. And then, I mean, the legend has it that they got signed at a Disneyland gig, DJing at Disneyland in Paris. But by that time, so many people have been buzzing about this demo. They were young. They weren't a part of the club scene. They weren't well known. They were just a couple of kids. But so that their way through was they really used the fact that a lot of UK and American DJs were coming over to Paris and got their way in there. It didn't help. It didn't harm them that Thomas, his dad, was quite famous and opened a lot of the old doors to the old clubs, the disco clubs, were open to them. Yeah,
And that's something that persists today. Like somebody, artists. I forget what the trope is, but when you look up an indie artist these days, you have to go to their Wikipedia page and their see if their parents' name has a blue link to go somewhere else.
I think music's always been like that. I find it. I mean, it's barefaced now, but my son might become a journalist. It's a family industry, isn't it? I think the thing was they had doors open to them, but a lot of the others didn't. So you had, on the techno side, you had a guy called Manu Le Malin, who was breaking down lots of barriers. He had his own label, putting out some incredible techno stuff, very experimental. He did an amazing piece with the Parisian Orchestra. It was just an incredible, phenomenal piece. But he's put on their parties in old swimming pools, empty swimming pools, discarded baths. Or there was another one that I went to in a mushroom farm under the underground in Paris. Well, there was another one we went to, which was a car park, a multi-story car park, which was cleared of cars for the night, and it turned into a 4-story rave, and it was all illegal. This is all illegal stuff. So a lot of the artists a lot of the DJs were keyed into that side of things. And then at the same time, you had one or two clubs. So you had Le Boy was quite a small club, but used to attract a lot of UK DJs over. And you had the early French touch DJs, or the early French DJs. I mean, Laurent Garnet is obviously one, but we're DJing there. And the Rex Club, which became probably the most famous. But actually, in terms of dance music at that time, Paris was terrible. There was nothing really happening there. There was no. It's different now. It's amazing, but at that time, there's not really very much. So you go over to check out the club scene, and it'd be, well, we've got to travel to Belgium. Yeah, there was nothing happening in France. There was nothing happening in Paris. But at the same time, the important thing that happened at that time, that period of music, geographically, you used to have to get a plane or a ferry from England to France, but they opened the Channel Tunnel. It had been built for years. They opened this thing, and suddenly you could jump on a train in London and you'd be in Paris like an hour and a half, 2 hours later, ready to party. So what happened is an awful lot of the DJs, an awful lot of the producers took advantage of that, and they started coming over to the UK all the time. So those early French touch DJs started to build their names by playing the small underground clubs in London. And then you had people like me. I mean, I did a lot of the very first interviews going over to Paris. So I was going over, interviewing in Paris, and then a few weeks later, they'd be back in London at some small club, 100 capacity. And so what happened was this: suddenly Paris became open, and London became an extension of Paris. That we became their club scene, but it became, like, at the same time, it was really easy to get over there and see them. And so you had Daft Punk had their studio just along the road at the bottom of the Montmartre steps. So really, a beautiful place. And they had their studio, and you go in, it's very, very calm and nice, and there's all working on little laptops or whatever. And like one time I interviewed them, it was for Melody Maker. It was NME's great rival. And I'd met them many, many times by the stage. But as soon as I started recording the interview, they pretended they couldn't speak English. And I was sitting there going, well, what is going on? This is ridiculous. So they were already thinking, how can they develop a mystique about themselves? And it was the first time they'd used masks as well. At that point, they started wearing these see-through masks. Up until then, there had just been a couple of lads who were quite happily didn't wear masks at all. But about 10 doors down the road from their studio, Air had their studio. And it was Air who used to get the complaints from the neighbours for making too much noise, because they had all these Moogs just vibrating the foundations.
It's amazing.
So the lovely, polite air boys were upsetting everybody, whereas
Yeah,
the
that's
edgy
opposite of what
daft
you would think.
the edgy Daft Punk kids. But it's great. The other thing I mentioned is I was writing for Melody Maker. There was a very important thing for us about Daft Punk was they'd been a really terrible band called Darling before that. And one of my colleagues at the time, David Jennings, reviewed a Darling gig in London and said something like they're just a bunch of Daft Punks, which is how they got their name, which I think was very, very, yeah, they were 14 or 15, so it showed a lot of wit. They saw something positive in that.
That's kind of that's a mature move to be able to take something like that and say, yeah, we'll run with that.
Yeah, they did, and they did well. They ran well.
So what's the kind of are there kind of sensibilities or sounds that kind of differentiate those artists, or is it really a geographical thing?
There was something we used to say. That's how the term French touch came about. It was trying to define what it is. I don't know what it is, but it's got a French touch. It's got this French feel to it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It didn't. I'm not sure what it was. I mean, there were some artists like Dimitri from Paris who played up the Frenchness thing and almost became like a stereotypical French character. And other artists on the other extreme, Daft Punk, one of the reasons they started wearing the helmets and became the robots was they were effectively trying to become international and deny their Frenchness. And they know that after a while they'd only speak through their manager, and you get a vocoded interview. Yeah, the robots are talking, but they separated themselves from the whole French identity very quickly. But some artists they kind of played on it a lot, and they just started getting artists around the world having hits, pretending to be French, like Jacques Lucan, who had a big hit with his pretend French sound. There's a few like it, but I don't know what it still baffles me now. I think it was almost like they weren't playing the rules in the same way. They were quite happy to break a lot of the rules, and England had got quite staid at that stage. There's lots of gatekeepers who were defining what was acceptable in electronic music and what was unacceptable. There were some very more increasingly powerful people in the industry who would they were gatekeeping things quite a lot. And the French guys, they would quite happily be mixing disco with dub, with hip hop, with scratching when they're doing a house set, doing all these different things, which was unique. There was nobody else really doing that at the time. So maybe that was the French touch.
Yeah. And where would you say it's gone since that 90s era, to today? Is there anybody who's kind of carried the torch, or anybody who kind of, kept it alive from then to now?
Well, I'm going to be honest, I don't keep a close eye on French music anymore. Occasionally things come through. I thought Miss Kitten and the Hacker, Miss Kitten was amazing when she came through. Justice, I think, are really good.
He may have been the catalyst for what we're doing here, because they've always been one of my favorites, and I finally was able to pass them on to my co-host. And I've always said Cross is one of those albums where, like, if I'm giving it to somebody, I'm telling them, like, I'm really jealous that you get to hear this for the first time.
Yeah, it was a treat.
I mean, they're great artists, and actually they're managed by Pedro Winter, who was Daft Punk's manager, which had come out of exactly the same stable, if you like. So he mentored them very well. And Pedro Winter's probably the most important character in this whole story. He's in the middle of all of this. Really close friends with Philippe Starr. So he supported those early days of like we mentioned Motorbass, but he was really involved in that. So Pedro Winter put on a lot of the early parties as well, that brought a lot of the original French touch people together. So Justice came out of a tradition, and that was the interesting thing. And there's a transition for me is Daft Punk's Homework was really about two young people listening to loads of music, American, primarily American forms of house and techno. And each track is an homage to a particular style or a particular producer or DJ. So it's not really an original thing. What they're doing is creating their version of something. They were doing their homework on that first album. The second album, they start finding their own sound. But that same thing was happening, being replicated through Paris. It went from being, we're doing our versions of America in the UK. And yeah, other countries exist, but America and the UK for house and techno. Sorry, Germany. But by the whole French touch scene also started developing its own voice as well. So it started by trying to be something else. And I'll go back to what I said earlier on. The importance of hip hop in this is quite phenomenal. There was a, I don't know if you know about there was a ruling in France that all radio on the radio, all songs, I think it was an 80% quota, had to be French language. So
Interesting.
French hip hop, that was to help keep their French culture alive and to stop the American rock and roll culture taking over everything. But French hip hop did really well because of this, because it's hip hop in French. And so when the guys from Motorbase were producing a lot of the French artists, the things they were learning through that were being taken into the house scene in France. So as it developed its own style, French style, big part of it was the importance of French hip hop.
Interesting.
So it's. I kind of go back to that question: what was French touch? I don't know what I can't answer it. I spent 1,200 words in a book trying to understand what it was, only to say, well, I don't know what it is. But
well, yeah, I think then we can definitely we'll definitely take that answer then.
As they say in French, it's a certain je ne sais quoi.
Well, yeah. But, I jokingly said that we said that Paris, people thought Paris didn't ever produce anything great, but Paris has produced some incredible music over the years, or France generally. And I think it's a very English or British thing to put down and ignore our the country that's closest to us. I don't know what it is. It's something cultural and historical, but I've always loved French music.
And even, like even the term, another genre, even the term krautrock was, it's kind of originally that's like a derogatory.
Slightly derogatory, yeah, very much so. And if you read some of NME's features on Kraftwerk at that time, they're very, they wouldn't get away with saying the things now that they said back then. But I mean, to my eternal shame, when I wrote a big piece about the French scene for Melody Maker, the editor said, "Oh no, we can't use the word French touch," and so he came up with the word baguette beat. I mean, that's just so insulting. Calling it baguette beat, just rude. But that was,
that's not a rough one from now on, though.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is, for me, that was in the middle of Britpop, and so it's kind of a nationalistic thing going on in the UK at that time. So there's a lot of putting down other countries, but the French touch became the term that the French government used in the 2000s for a cultural regeneration program, and to be 2012, I think. And I got a friend who'd gone to the Pompidou Centre in Paris, said, "Martin, as you walk through the doors to this massive exhibition, there's a picture of you with your quote, with one of your quotes." And I was like, "Oh, nobody said anything to me. Nobody from France invited me over." But I did have the surreal experience of going to the French ambassador to London, his Bastille Day celebration in 2002 or 2004, some around that sort of time. And as I walked in, I was announced as Martin James, the man who invented French touch. It's kind of weird. It was one of those very surreal moments. But ever since then, a lot of academics have made it their life work to prove that it's nothing to do with me.
Oh, rude.
Which, hey, I'm an academic as well, so I love to spar.
I was going to say that's where the combat is going on.
Well, they're all colleagues, they're all colleagues, and I don't mind at all. So.
I'd be like, I was physically there.
Yeah. Well, I do get that a lot. I wrote a book about drum and bass. I mean, the jungle. Yes. It's called State of Bass, and it's the very first book about jungle and drum and bass. And we reissued it in 2000. Excuse me, 2020, and just in time for the lockdown. Perfect timing. And some people on Twitter, because it was lockdown and people had nothing better to do than be online all the time. And they start saying, what does this white middle-aged professor know about jungle drum and bass? And it kind of started building, and it was quite a very obviously stressful time. The whole Black Lives Matter thing was happening around this time, and I thought, I'm getting caught up in this. This is insane. And so I've written about this music since it first emerged. This is my music. And it took a lot of the DJs in the scene to come in and tell what are effectively young 20-something people that they were wrong. That what do I know about the scene is I was there. I was a part of the scene. I wrote about the scene. I was there documenting. So I may be old now, but once I was young. And
they probably weren't expecting to look into the background of their
well, they don't often. People don't often. Yeah, I don't mind. It was a good time.
So you mentioned State of Bass, and I saw that's the name of a record label you run too. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's a name that kind of stuck with me, and I'm kind of known as State of Bass. It's my online handle and everything. And I set up a book company first to redo a Prodigy book. So I'm Prodigy's was their official record label biographer.
Yeah, I was going to say expect a call from us when Fat of the Land comes up on the on the random album poll.
Plenty to say about that one. Not my favorite of their albums, though. But so I used to get a call from Liam Howler, and who'd say, "Martin, come in the studio and listen to the album." And this was, we're getting geared up to go. So I go and listen, and I interview him, and write a bit biography for it. And then I wrote sleeve notes for their compilation albums. So their Law compilation albums. There's an essay inside that I wrote. And I'd already written a couple of books about them. So, but I'd never really earned anything from these books. And it was just insane that I thought, they've got this artist who at one time was the biggest selling artist from the UK, outselling Oasis and, outselling Radiohead by 10 to 1, 10 albums to 1. And I didn't earn a penny from these books. So I decided to republish them myself and republish it. And I called the imprint State of Bass. And in the meantime, I started making some music with a colleague of mine, Sean Albies, and we said, "Hey, let's put this out." So we tested the water with something he'd done under the name Ghost Electron, which was kind of ambient piano music. Our stuff was under the ludicrous name Nostalgia Death Star.
I did hear some of that too. so that's you and Sean.
That's me and Sean.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So we did that, and the early stuff was very Depeche Mode-y and New Order-y. And then from there, we started signing other bands to the label, and we put out a regular compilation, or we're putting out the last one of these compilations called Generation Blitz, which aims to to bring in lots of unknown or unsigned or grassroots synth pop artists from around the world, or certainly artists who have been inspired by the Blitz era of music, which is kind of like the Chumish music Neu, etc., through David Bowie and up to Visage, and then beyond into the Human League, Heaven 17, all that kind of stuff. And subsequently, I started working with a colleague, a friend in Australia, and we produced something called Moth Loop, which is a much more upbeat, but it's inspired by disco, I'd say, but messed up disco. We called it contaminated disco. And the original thing was I was trying to get. I've just been diagnosed with ADHD, which is almost like a cliche now, but it's. I was going, well, hang on. So the way I've been thinking all my life, the way I am, is actually not like everybody else. So I hear lots of voices talking at me all the time, and I jump from thing to thing all the time. I have about 10 projects going on at all. So he says, no, that's ADHD. So I wanted to get that feeling, the feeling of my brain on record. So that's what Moth Loop was. And we continue to do it. So with the next Nostalgia Death Star albums out in July. And that is a response to the death of the university. The universities are being destroyed right now by neoliberal ideas and ridiculous, stupid politicians.
So, it seems to be a hour to hour thing going on over on our side.
Yeah, it's happening throughout the world right now. Throughout the world.
But I definitely wanted to shout out Sean Albiez, because he was the initial person when I started sending around kind of cold emails thinking about this episode. He was the first person who got back to us, and I was excited because, from his history that I had seen, looked up, it looked like he was, an electronic music historian, and I was saying, this is the guy to get. But when he replied to us, he suggested that we talk to you. And number one, I was surprised that he replied at all. But number two, I was surprised that he had an even better source. But yeah, once we got your biography and did our little research, I was blown away that we'd get to talk to somebody that had more than knowledge, but was there. We would have been happy just with somebody who considered themselves an expert, but I think we got the guy.
Sean's all those things too. I mean, he's phenomenal. He does his research is incredible. His work on theremin is completely changed the way we view that instrument. His work on early electronic music is just completely blowing things away. He's just a quiet researcher who makes a loud noise with his research. So I think he's a fantastic guy, and he's one of my best friends. So I blame him for getting me into lecturing. He invited me in to talk about French connections, to talk about the history of French electronic music to his students, having first interviewed me for a paper he's writing about the French scene. And so he's a great guy, and I love making music with him as well.
Awesome. I guess kind of maybe for my final question, I'll open it up a little wider, but have you ever had any like run-ins or stories involving our show's kind of namesake, the NME magazine, or any opinions on them or their top 500? Besides the disagreement on number one, but I think pretty much everyone we've talked to who's had an opinion has said that they want to replace the number one album at this point.
Well, okay, so you've got to remember that I worked at Melody Maker, and NME and Melody Maker in the same building, published for the same publishing company, IPC. We worked out of King's Reach Towers over on the south side of south of the bridge in London. They were our enemies. We always used to say we write first about the artist that NME will get an exclusive on next week. So our big thing was breaking the artists. Melody Maker was a little bit esoteric. People like Simon Reynolds came out of Melody Maker. But it was nonsense, really, because we're all good friends, really. But the top 500, I get really fed up with with a lot of these lists, because a lot of them, I don't like a lot of these artists that are celebrated. And I often wonder, why are you celebrating it? Is it because you've been told it's great? What is great about this album, really? And then what I read a lot of the stuff in these top 500 lists, it's just like a repetition, churning out the same stuff about it. and it amazes me some of the albums they might have got a great artist, but they don't seem to get the greatest album by that artist. There's loads of things missing. I'd say, where is Sensational Alex Harvey Band on the rock side? Where's Todd Rundgren on the more sort of psychedelic rock side? Where are bands like the No Wave, or the post-punk bands like Shriekback? Why is it with the same Talking Heads albums?
For 500 albums on there, it's surprisingly almost cliche at times. And to your point, there's a few that, like, really, is that you put the Smiths at number one? Is that even the best Smiths album, or is that just, the voting numbers added up that way? So some strange magic behind it. Yeah.
I think there's kind of there's a crushing of history going on, and the history becomes flattened. If you say often enough that the greatest band in the post-punk era were Joy Division, people start saying the greatest band was Joy Division, but they were terrible live. I saw them a number of times. They were awful live. And their first album was, okay, that's quite good, but it didn't send huge ripples across all of the youth of Britain going, wow, the greatest band that ever lived. They were incredible. That happened after Ian Curtis died. And suddenly our generation had somebody to go, oh, he died. He was so romantic how he died. He took his own life after listening to Iggy Pop's The Idiot. What a genius record. And reading, I think it was Sylvia Plath Beljar or something. He was like this tragic myth story starts to emerge. And we're all going, wow, yes, he's our anti-hero. And then the second album, Closer, came out, and it fit. It was just incredible. That's a brilliant album. That's an incredible album. But up until that, I remember seeing them, Joy Division, touring with Killing Joke. And Killing Joke used to blow them off stage every night. It was Joy Division. I was Joy Division on again. All right, then. Okay, let's go to the bar. So the myth, and what's happening is this mythology is flattening history as well. So you look at Smiths, and they've got to have the greatest Smiths album because everybody says they were the greatest album, great band of the era. They were very patchy, and that actually album, the greatest album, the number one album, is one of their more patchy albums, I think.
Right.
So
yeah,
I'm not a big fan of lists.
Yeah. when you talk about flattening, even when you've got the space of 500, you've still got Arctic Monkeys on there somewhere along with Elvis, and just that's hard to reconcile.
And yet there's just sort of very few black artists. There's very where I don't think Fela Kuti is on there at all. Probably one of the most globally influential artists of the moment. The Afrobeat sound and the influence on the younger generation to create Afrobeats is globally powerful. And I looking through, I couldn't see anything by him. The typical hip hop artists, guaranteed you're going to get Public Enemy and fantastic. But there was an awful lot more going on in that era, and also very selective about the 80s artists, and I think a lot of the music fans snobbery comes out in those lists that we can't celebrate. Now, for me, one of the great albums of the 80s, I love Janet Jackson, Control. Where is it?
Yeah.
Production value alone, that album just shot music production light years ahead. Yeah. So I think there's a lot missing from those lists. But like I said earlier on, I'm the worst person in a music quiz. I don't really like very much mainstream music. But when I do, I often like the things that you're not supposed to like. So, I'm the guy who sat in a meeting at Melody Maker with Simon Price, who was the guy who was obsessed with music, with Manic Street Preachers, and wrote the definitive book about Manic Street Preachers. And I was in an editorial meeting with him and all of the rest of the team who are obsessed with Manic Street Preachers. And they were all looking for a new angle for a feature. And I said, why don't you write an article about how they're a bit rubbish, really? And they're taking music backwards. And they said, well, who would you have? I said, well, Juan Atkins is in town. Juan Atkins, along with the Cybertron, created a revolution called techno. Techno is the biggest revolution in music that's ever going to happen. And they're all going, no, rubbish. Of course, years and years later, we have Charlie XCX and all these pop artists who are the biggest artists in the world, who are techno artists, basically.
Mhm.
Yeah. The backing music for, I mean, two of the most gigantic album releases recently were the Weeknd, who had the very first track is produced by Justice, and then Lady Gaga just recently, she's got a big feature from Gesaffelstein on there, and both of those albums, it's not like it's just the feature. Both of those albums very, very much sound like, even if it's not them, those artists definitely took that sound to somebody and said, like, I want my album to sound like this. Like, that's the mainstream right now.
Yeah, and we're about to have a huge electro clash revival. It's just really coming through. And
I'll be there for that.
Electro clash, which should have been huge the first time around, and that sort of indie trash aesthetic, the trasthetic. But there's a lot of new artists coming through that sound now, and you can already hear the more established artists stealing it. It's so quick. It's so, at least you had time to develop in the past, but now everything's so fast. But yeah, so going back to your original question about the top five, I don't like lists of things. I do not agree with the Smiths ever being number one. And friends will tell you that back in the day when John Peel used to do his top 50, the festive 50 of John Peel's songs, and they were dominated for 2 years in a row by the Smiths and the Cocteau Twins. I was always with the Cocteau Twins. I found the Smiths a bit blokey. I found the Smiths a bit tired, boring. I did have some of their songs. I'm sorry, all the Smiths fans in the world, although you're very passionate about the Smiths, but I found lyrically really interesting, but I enjoyed a bit, but I couldn't eat a whole one. I could never get to a whole album. Whereas the Cocteau Twins, I could listen endlessly to.
It's kind of affirming hearing you say that, because I think this list, for us has definitely forced us to look at some of those bands, and, maybe before we didn't get it. And I'd say, something like the Smiths, I'm still not getting the hoopla. I wasn't from England. I don't have that relationship with it, and I didn't grow up with those tunes, but it's certainly refreshing to hear that somebody, else doesn't necessarily agree with that coronation of them being the best.
Which is probably why I never became the editor of NME.
Yeah, you might have to hide that during the interview for the job, I think.
Yeah, it's too late for me. I've handed it all over now. I only occasionally write for magazines now.
I do have to know, though, you found Pink Floyd boring back in the day. Did they ever click for you?
I've got to be honest with you. I listened to them a lot up until The Wall. I think I switched off from The Wall onwards. But I think they're a great band, and I think my boredom was a little bit more like I was young and I was surrounded by old people. Like I said, they were all 18, 19, 20. And it didn't make sense to me at that stage. I was at that point. I was more into Bowie, T-Rex, Alex Harvey, and all those sort of things. This band with nothing but light show and inflatable pigs or whatever was going on meant very little to me.
I had a similar experience with Eric Clapton at age 13, where it's me and a bunch of parents basically in an arena, and it was like, okay, this is cool, this is good. And now 25, 30 years later, I would give to be anything to be hearing that show again, but at the time it was just like, okay, this is what a concert's like. Right on.
Well, I remember taking two of my kids to see the Prodigy, and my eldest daughter loves them. She's really, really into them. I was on the road with the Prodigy, and my wife went into labor, and I had to be flying back from Paris, interestingly, to get there. So she was kind of a Prodigy baby. But my son, he's 4 years old, 4 years younger. He just never got it. And I remember taking him to a gig, and we were standing side stage. I mean, literally, we're on the stage with them. And you couldn't be in a better place. You see all the band going insane. You see all the audience going insane. It was the power, the sound was incredible. And I was thinking, this is going to really excite him. And at the end of it, I said, "How did you think? What did you think?" He goes, "Can we go for a KFC now?" I even
heart wants what the heart wants. Yeah.
I even got them to sponsor his football team. So there's all these little 10-year-old, 11-year-old kids in their soccer kits. Yeah, they had the full Prodigy logo on there, and they used to play "Invaders Must Die" before they went on the pitch. You know, but you know he never loved it. But that's great. I think that's the way it should be. My youngest, she's 21. She hates a lot of the stuff I listen to. She loves all the pop stuff that I don't quite understand, but she loves it. I think it's absolutely right that we should turn around to our parents who take us to an Eric Clapton gig and say, "What was that all about? It was really boring."
Exactly. Like, thanks for taking me. Not ungrateful, but I don't know. I'd rather go see something, I can connect with.
As a lecturer, I always found it a bit disconcerting when students kind of parroted their parents' record collections at me as being great records. And I think, yeah, why? They were to us, but come on, your stuff's amazing. Your generation, right. You've got some great stuff in your generation.
Because mom and dad told us so. That's why.
Yeah. But then,
all right. Well, real life is calling me back. So I just wanted to say thank you very much. We will definitely be contacting you if you'll have us again.
Oh yeah, I'd love to do it again.
All right. Yeah, well, if you guys still got stuff to talk about, feel free. I bet it's just me. My work is saying your lunch has been absolutely French style at this point. I was actually just telling my wife this morning about how they will riot if anybody takes 15 minutes off of their lunch breaks, and I was like, I should be so lucky. But that's me bringing it all back. But thanks, Martin.
All right. No, it's been a pleasure, and thank you.
Martin, where can we find any work of yours? Drop the titles of the book again, just so we can get them out there one more time.
Well, I've got the book on French music called French Connections, and that's on Velocity. And the drum and bass book is State of Bass, the origin story, or the origins of jungle drum and bass. And it's also on Velocity. I've got a new Prodigy book that's almost ready, which is the second part of the story, the more recent part of the story. And excellent. That's coming on State of Bass Publishing.
Outstanding. Do you have an online presence anywhere you like to post or share music, anything of that nature?
I know I'm terrible with socials. I'm around, but I don't usually. I was obsessed, but I don't usually use them as much now. And I have a very. I don't even keep my blog updated anymore because you just nobody reads them.
Yeah, it's hard to find the energy some days to do those. We have one running with the show simultaneously where I'm pairing a recipe as a chef, with our album of the week, and it's like, well,
oh wow,
a handful of clicks. Okay, do I really want to go through 3 hours of writing just for? Yeah, I said I'd do it.
Well, actually, was trying to start a podcast, but I just think there are so many great podcasts out there already. You don't need me as well.
Hey, we appreciate you having me on this one, and certainly looking forward to next time down the road talking a little bit more.
Great, looking forward to it. Nice to see you guys.
Sure. Thanks so much, Martin.
Take care. Bye now.